But now let's turn to the talk this afternoon. And Andrew probably doesn't need much of an introduction to many of you, actually. He's been a member of BENHS since, I believe, 1978. Is that right, Andrew? Quite a long time ago.
Yes, I think that's right.
And of course, before he took retirement, he was the principal entomologist for the Royal Horticultural Society at Wisley. And as a consequence, has huge experience of entomology and published many books on things like garden pests, but also not just about insects as pests for gardeners, but as the pollinators, as insect conservation. He's one of those really annoying people, I find, that just has this incredible breadth of knowledge about entomology, which is just wish I had the same level. So amazing knowledge, and we're very pleased, Andrew, that you're here today, and you continue to support the whole of council with your work on it as well, so thank you for that. But your talk today is about a group of insects that perhaps get a little bit left behind in some ways, but there are around 530 different species, I believe, in the UK, so it's a big group, it's an important group. There are some pest species as well, and it's a group that actually you'll be able to find even more about after today's talk if you sign up for the workshop that both Andrew here and also Andrew Green will be leading at Dinton Pastures on Saturday, 12th of April this year, 10:30 till 4. So a sawfly identification workshop in practice at Dinton. So do look out for that, sign up for it on the website if you'd like to continue. And to whet your appetite today, we're very pleased that Andrew's agreed to give his talk about a beginner's guide to sawflies. And over to you, Andrew, for that.
Thank you, Ray. I will now share screen, I hope. Right, hopefully you now see that.
Yep, got that.
Very good, okay. Yeah, I had difficulty moving the slide on there for a moment. So first of all, what are sawflies? Well, they are considered to be at the primitive end of the Hymenoptera. The fossil record goes back to the Cretaceous era. Big difference between the sawflies and the rest of the Hymenoptera, the more advanced things like ants, bees and wasps, is with the sawflies, you don't get a narrow, restricted wasp waist. The abdomen is joined full on to the thorax. Another feature unique to sawflies is what are called cencri or cencrus in the singular, which is these two little raised areas here, which are thought to be responsible for holding the wings in place when they're folded back over the insect's body. Another feature of female sawflies is they have a twin-bladed saw-like structure, which is normally held within the abdomen. But when the female is laying eggs, she'll extend the saws and use the bladed structures to cut a slit in the plant tissues in order to insert the eggs. The various families which make up the Symphyta sawflies, you'll see there's a number of relatively small families here until you get down to the Tenthrodinidae, which is quite a big one. And if you add all those together, Ray, I think, said 530, 529 there. The number keeps going up and down a little bit. Some things disappear and new species get found in Britain. Now we'll have a quick look at what the various families look like. The Cephidae, these are relatively narrow-bodied, slim sawflies, very often black with yellow banding. And they have larvae which feed as stem borers, particularly in grasses and certain other herbaceous plants. Also some species which are stem borers in woody plants. The Pamphylidae, there's I think like 20 species in this family, they have an appearance of being squashed. The body is much wider than it is deep, as you can see from the dorsal view and the side view here. Both the head and the body had a squashed appearance. They have very long antennae, or relatively long antennae, with lots of segments in them. Some of these pamphylids have larvae that feed gregariously in silk webbing, but some have a habit of making individual leaf rolls. They cut the leaf and roll it up like this and feed inside there. There are also certain other insects, like certain weevils and Lepidoptera, which also make leaf rolls, but this is quite distinctive shape for a pamphylid larva. Wood wasps, these are the sort of giants of the symphyta world. The giant wood wasp, which you see on the right there, can be 40, 50 millimeters in length. And they have, again, long antennae. And in a female, they have what looks like a fairly fierce sting in the rear end here. But it's not really a sting, it's part of their egg-laying apparatus, because wood wasps lay their eggs in dead wood, particularly in the case of Eurocera species and Cyrex, in conifers. And so it's either trees which have died naturally or trees which have been felled, which particularly attract them. The Argidae, this is a family of around 20 species. Distinctive feature of these is that the antennae have only 3 segments, which is much smaller than any other family in the symphyta. They come in sort of 2 color forms. Some have yellow abdomens, some are all black, some have patterned wings. There's a dark pattern here, and again you can see on this one the dark pattern there. And another feature of them is the antennae are upswept. With most sawflies, they're held horizontally, but with the Argidae, they are sticking up in the air. Larvae of these feed on a range of herbaceous and woody plants. Away. Leptococomidae, only 1 species of this, and it's fairly uncommon. I haven't been able to find a decent picture of the actual insect, so there's a drawing here. And this is associated with Dryopterous ferns. The larvae are stem borers, and where they've been feeding, you get a sort of white, sticky froth appearing, not to be confused with the froth produced by froghoppers, which is a very watery substance. The froth produced by this sawfly is decidedly sticky. Symbicidae, a fairly easy family to recognize because it's the only sawfly which have clubbed antennae. Having said that, not always easy to identify the species, particularly the Trichiosoma species. There's some doubt as to how many species there actually are, which doesn't help. Dipryonidae, I call these conifer sawflies. There are some sawflies in other families which feed on conifers, particularly the Tenthredinidae. But in the Dipryonidae, these are all conifer feeders, particularly on things like Scots pine, spruce, and juniper. And in this family, you get quite an obvious sexual dimorphism. The females are bigger than the males. They're often paler in color, and there are big differences in the antennae. The females have just linear antennae, whereas the males have these fan-like structures, which are very distinctive. Some of these conifer sawflies are quite important as forestry pests, so affecting some of the conifer plantations. Tenthredinidae, this is the big family, and I just put some examples in here in the next few slides to give an indication of sort of range of colors, really. Dolorous species, some are all black, some are black with partly orangey red markings, feeding as larvae on things like grasses, rushes, sedges, and horsetails. Athalia rosei, This is commonly known as the turnip sawfly, and it's of interest because it's a species which can sometimes come here as a migrant from elsewhere in Europe. It is native to this country. The larvae feed on a wide range of brassicaceae plants, including turnips. The Strongylagaster over here is a bracken feeder. You'll often see it during the late spring, early summer on the tops of bracken fronds where the females are busy laying eggs. That's black with sort of a brownish yellow banding on it. Go back, sorry. The Atlanta species here is black with a sort of creamy white ivory markings. That has larvae which feed on rose foliage. And Eutomastiphus ophipium is quite a small sawfly, black head, reddish brown thorax, black abdomen, and that's associated with grasses. This is a sort of rogues gallery here of sawflies, all in the Tenthredinidae family. I call it a rogues gallery because they are sort of things which are relatively big and showy, and novice entomologists just starting out with sawflies will often collect these. A word of warning though, the adults of these species are predatory. If you suck them up into your pooter, by the time you get home, you'll find that quite a lot of the other insects that you have in your pooter are no longer as fresh and good looking as you thought they were going to be. Pachypotasis ropi over here is black with white markings. Rogagaster species, generally green with black markings. The green colour is quite obvious in life, but with pin specimens, that green colour fades to a sort of yellowish colour, which can be confusing if you're trying to use a key to identify it, and the key says it's green, and the specimen in front of you is sort of a dirty yellow colour. Tenthredo, a lot of different colour forms in Tenthredo. Quite a few have this yellow and black banding appearance. Macrophylla species, these can be quite good mimics of pompilid spider wasps because they have sort of longer legs than most sawflies, which is a characteristic they share with pompilid wasps. And also they've got quite obvious spurs, particularly on the hind legs here, which is another feature you might expect to see on a pompilid. And this particular species, Annulata, black and red colour here, again, is typical of some pompilid wasps. Aglostigma ocuparia is of interest really because it's probably the first sawfly to appear in the spring. It has larvae which are associated with cleavers, goosegrass, Galium species. Still more Tenthredinidae. Hemerocroa is brown at the front end, black at the back. Nematina steenii, sort of orangey brown all over with darkened wings. Yeah, in recent years, the European taxonomists have pulled a bit of a trick on us. They have reorganized the nematine species of the sawfly. At one time, we had a genus called Eura, which had about 10 species in it. The European taxonomists have now decided that some of the other nematine families are also Eura. So nearly all of our Nematous species, all of our Amoronematous, all of our Pachynematous, all of our Pontania, and all of the Phylocolpa species are now classified as being in Eura. Just to complicate things a little bit more, there are 2 species of Nematous which remain Nematous, but they've been joined by our 4 Crassus species. So now we have 6 species in Nematous and an awful lot in Eura. One of the features of what was formerly known as Crassus is that the hind metatarsus is expanded. So it's very easy to identify sawflies which were in the genus Crassus, but now part of Nematous. What used to be Nematous, it has a lot of different species, some yellow, some black, some pale green like this one. The Amoronematous species, generally quite early emerging. laying their eggs in the opening buds of various woody plants. The Zephyridae, they're sort of small wood wasps, and like the larger wood wasps, they are associated with dead wood. Not of conifers, though. These are things like oak, sallow, and alder. And again, the females have a sort of protruding egg-laying structure there. The Xyelidae, these are quite tiny little things. They're only about sort of 3.5 millimeters in length. And again, females have long ovipositors here, and they will be laying their eggs in the male catkins on conifers, particularly Scots pine. So life cycle of sawflies is not all the same species on this page. You've got a mating pair here. I've never actually observed any courtship behavior in sawflies. I have seen male sawflies crash land on a female and immediately link up, so it seems to be a very rapid process. Having mated, the female will lay eggs, although there are some species which are parthenogenic, they don't have males, and some species which do have males can still lay viable eggs even if they're not mated. But in that case, the eggs will develop into adults ultimately, which are all male. But normally mating is the norm. And when the eggs are laid, they will produce both males and females. In this species illustrated here, the eggs are deposited on the leaf surface, but more usually sawflies insert the eggs into the plant tissues, either into the leaf blade or the leaf stalk, or into the stems of a plant, depending on the species of sawfly. The eggs will hatch out into little larvae, which start nibbling away at the foliage. As they get bigger, their appetites increase and they eat more and more of the foliage. And ultimately, they will go into a pre-pupal phase. And when that happens, they often lose a lot of the markings and colour shown by the actively feeding larvae. This pre-pupal larva will then usually leave the plant and go into the soil, or sometimes they will bore into a stem, into rotten wood, something like that. And they will spin a cocoon around themselves, and they will remain in that cocoon as a pre-pupal larva for sometimes quite a long time, sometimes over winter. And they only become what you might call a proper pupa just a few weeks before they're due to emerge as an adult insect. Some species have, most species have 1 generation a year. Some have 2 generations, and there are some which have 3. We look at various forms of larvae. Some species of sawfly, particularly those which have larvae that feed together gregariously, have this habit of waving their tails in the air when they're alarmed. It's presumably a means of trying to ward off a potential predator or parasite. If you see larvae doing that, that's a good indication that they are sawfly larvae. Generally, Lepidoptera, moth and butterfly larvae don't do that. The other way to distinguish sawfly larvae from those of Lepidoptera is to count the clasping legs on the abdomen. Both Lepidoptera and sawfly larvae have 3 pairs of jointed legs on the thorax, so there's no difference there. But with Lepidoptera, you have a maximum of 5 pairs of clasping legs. With sawflies, it's generally 7. So as soon as you counted beyond 5, you know you're into sawfly territory. This species here, Eriocampa ovata, is one which you find on alder. It's very distinctive. It has this sort of flocculent white waxy material secreted from its body. It's presumably pretending to be a bird dropping to try and disguise its appearance. Another species which you find on alder is Platycampus. That has flattened larvae. It looks as though they've been squashed flat almost. And it does resemble, to a certain extent, some types of hoverfly larvae. Caliroa species, these are commonly known as slugworms because they do have a rather slimy appearance. The body is covered in mucilage. And they have a method of feeding. They don't eat the entire leaf, they just graze away part of the leaf surface, so that the damaged area then dries up and turns brown. And there are some species like the Periclista species, which you find on oak, which are quite spiny. These have bifurcated spines. They look like a letter Y sticking up from the body. Feeding habits, some larvae feed as solitary larvae and make relatively small holes in the foliage. There are other species which stay together as a family group when they hatch, and they can sometimes cause quite extensive defoliation. Eurovibesii, better known as the common gooseberry sawfly. If you've had gooseberries or red currants in your garden defoliated, it's quite likely to have been by this species, although there are two other sawflies which also occur on those plants. Endylomia aethiops is one of the slugworms, the rose slugworm. This one isn't particularly slimy, but it does feed in the slugworm manner by grazing away part of the leaf surface and causing this sort of pale area, which will eventually go brown. There are some species which cause galls on plants. Various Pontanea species cause what are known as bean galls. They look a bit like a baked bean in the leaf blade here. What happens is the female sawfly lays an egg in the leaf tissues and at the same time secretes chemicals which induce the gall to form. When the egg hatches out, the larva then feeds inside the gall, gradually hollowing it out. There are several species of sawfly which live as leaf miners on both trees, shrubs, and some herbaceous plants. If you hold the leaf up to the light, it becomes semi-transparent, and you can often see the larvae feeding inside in this species. There are several larvae, 1, 2, 3 there, all feeding together, and so you get an irregular shaped lotch mine. There are some larvae which feed internally as stem borers, like the Kephidae, for example, and the one shown here is the giant wood wasp larva feeding inside a dead conifer. And there are some species which, as larvae, are fruit borers. On the bottom right here, you've got the apple sawfly with some fruitlets which have been tunneled by the larvae. So what sort of plants do sawflies eat? Well, pretty well anything you can imagine. Equisetum species, horsetails, not many insects feed on those sort of plants, but there are several sawflies which will feed on them. Then you've got brackens and ferns, you've got conifers, grasses, sedges, rushes, various herbaceous plants. This isn't a complete list by any means. Shrubs of various sorts, fruit trees, bushes, cane fruits, deciduous trees. And some of these are recognized as garden plants, and where sawflies are sometimes a problem, and some, like the fruit pest, can be a problem in commercial orchards. Identification of sawflies. Well, if you go back in time, there's Cameron's Ray Society monograph produced in the 1880s. Not much use for identification these days because obviously names have changed and there have been a lot of species found in Britain since Cameron's time. But it has got some rather nice drawings of the adult sawflies and some of larvae as well. The larvae of sawflies are much less well known compared to the larvae of Lepidoptera. Still a number of species where the larval fruit plants are not known. The larvae have not been identified. But there are increasingly people who are looking for larvae, rearing them out, rearing adults, and photographing the larvae, which is quite important to build up this knowledge. Well, recently in this country, you have the Field Studies Council aid gap key to British sawflies. Aid gap keys are designed to be easy to use for people who don't have specialized taxonomic knowledge. This key will get you as far as genus. It doesn't go down to species unless it's a genus which has only got one species in this country. So to get down to species, you need to go to other sources. And we're still really largely dependent on Benson's Royal Entomological Society keys, which were written in the 1950s. So they are now a bit out of date. Names have changed and some additional species have been found, but it does work for the majority of species which you're likely to encounter. It's arranged in three parts. Part A is all the small families. Parts B and C are the Tenthredinidae. Part A was allegedly revised in 1981, and that is still in print. I say allegedly because the people who did it didn't really add very much to it, but they did manage to introduce an error into the key to Arge species, which doesn't help. Good news is, although these two other parts are out of print, if you go on the Royal ENTSOC website in publications, you can download free of charge those parts which are out of print, and that will also include the original Part A. So you get an example of that which doesn't have the error in the Arge key. Well, recently, Jean Lacour, a French man, has produced Sawflies of Europe. It's a sort of monumental work. It came out in 2020. It covers about 1,400 species. So there's a lot of insects in there, which you hope are not going to see in Britain. There are problems with the book. It's rather small page size, so it's quite a thick book. And when you try and open it, it doesn't open flat. Some of the text disappears into the binding. And also, Michel Lacour has different ideas on taxonomy. He doesn't agree with the recent revision of the nematines, but he uses his own names, which don't really accord with those which have been commonly used in this country in the past. So it's sometimes a bit of a puzzle to know where you're going. But it is a useful book in some sense. It's helped us to recognize we have some additional species in this country which have previously gone unnoticed. It does have quite a lot of photographs of pinned insects and of larvae. And so if you've got photographs or pictures of the adults, for example, if you're going through the key, you can refer to a picture, and if you two don't match up what you're looking at under the microscope, then you've probably gone wrong. Sort of characteristics which are used to identify sawflies. These are drawings taken from Benson's keys, and many of his drawings will also appear in Lecourt's book. To get to the families, numbers of antennae, segments in the antennae can be important, the form of the antenna. Other characteristics, the wing venation, the number of cells in the wings, where the cross veins occur on the lengthwise veins, these sort of characteristics used to get to the families and to the genus. In some genera, the genitalia is useful in determining a species. In the case of the females, it's the saws, the amount of teeth on the bottom edge, and whether there are cross lines on the saw blade itself. For the males, you've got a pair of penis valves, which can sometimes be quite distinctive. It is really a question of getting to know which genera require genitalia. They require to look at the genitalia so that when the specimen is still fresh, you can pull the saw or the penis valves out so they're then visible. It's much harder, of course, to try and get the genitalia out if it's a long dead dry specimen. Now, not everybody wants to fiddle around with the rear end of sawflies. Don't worry, there are some species which you can confidently identify without recourse to a taxonomic key or going through a microscope. These are species which either cause quite distinctive feeding damage on the host plants, or they may be the only sawfly which occurs on a particular plant, or it may be an insect which has a very distinctive appearance. So here we are, part 2 of my talk, some easily identified sawflies. Apple sawfly, for example. The adult you'll find flying around at the time when apples are in flower, and they lay their eggs on the basal part of the flower, the receptacle. When the larva hatches out, it initially makes a tunnel just underneath the surface of the fruit and then goes into the center of the fruitlet and eats out part of the core. Fruits which have been damaged in that way will drop off the tree during June, part of the June drop. And so you may find damaged fruits underneath the tree at that time. Sometimes, however, the insect, the larva, dies before it can bore into the center of the fruit. And if all it's done is just make that tunnel underneath the surface of the skin, those fruits will stay on the tree and they will mature. And by the time they are mature, they have this very distinctive long curving scar, which is where the larva had done that initial feeding underneath the stem. So this is an insect you can go on recording right through the summer, because you can see these scars on the fruit at the time when the fruit is ready for picking. If you've got maggots inside the apple at picking time, that's codling moth. Apple sawfly maggots or larvae are only there during the late spring, and so these are small apple fruitlets rather than mature fruits which have dropped off the tree. Similarly, a related species, plum sawfly, also emerges and lays its eggs at the time when plums are in flower, and the larvae will bore into the plum fruitlets. In this case, there's no mining under the skin. They just seem to go straight into the fruit, and you get a bit of thrash on the outside. So that's something you can look for if you haven't seen the adults. If you're finding plum fruitlets with little holes in them, open them up, you'll find hopefully a sawfly larva inside. Again, with plums, you get something called plum moth, which has caterpillars inside the ripe fruit at the end of summer, whereas this is in the late spring, early summer. Pear and cherry slugworm, there are several slugworm species, but only one has got black slimy larvae. And this is something which you'll find on various rosaceae trees and shrubs, things like hawthorn, pear, cherry, so on, Pyracantha, Cotoneaster. And this has one which has several generations during the summer. You can still find larvae feeding well into October in some years. So slimy black larvae and chewed, grazed away leaf surface, things to look for. The adults themselves, relatively undistinct. They're sort of black, paler markings on the legs, but the larvae are much more distinctive. Social pear sawfly, this is one of the pamphylids. These are the things which have a squashed appearance. And this is one which has got gregarious larvae which feed amongst silk webbing. It's a sort of brownish coloured silk. And again, it's on various plants in the Rosaceae family. There are several moth larvae which feed gregariously in silk webbing, but none of those have larvae which are orange colour with a black head. And so if you see a mass of larvae like that, then you know you've got social pear sawfly. Roses, both wild and cultivated, are affected by rose leaf rolling sawfly. Again, quite a small insect, about 3 to 4 millimeters in length as an adult. But these females will be busy laying eggs on expanded leaves like this. And as they lay the egg, the female will insert chemicals into the leaf, which cause the leaf to start to curl downwards at the edges. So it ends up forming quite tight leaf rolls. A week or so later, the egg has hatched out into a little pale green larva, which then proceeds to eat the rolled leaf. They don't necessarily eat all of the leaf, so these damaged leaves, these rolled leaves, can be found right through the summer. It has just one generation, and the active period for the adult sawflies, and when the actual leaf rolling occurs, is generally around mid-April through to end of May, early June. Berberis sawfly, this is something which came into the country from elsewhere in Europe in about the year 2000. When it first turned up, it was quite damaging to plants in gardens of Berberis, particularly Berberis sunburgii, which is probably the most widely grown type of Berberis. It seems to have calmed down a bit now. Possibly its various predators, parasites have caught up with it and it's helping to reduce its numbers. The adults are sort of shiny black with darkened wings, upswept antennae. The female is quite easily distinguished from other black Irish species because the saw sheath, which you can see at the rear here, is like a pair of pincers. There's a big gap in the middle there. Other Irish species in this country, which are black, have sort of more solid triangular shaped saw sheaths, which are held together. So there's no gap between them. So if you've got a black sawfly of the Irish species, and you can see that sort of open area between the saw sheath there, you know you've got Irish Berberidis. Doesn't seem to like the evergreen species of Berberis, but it will feed on Mahonia sometimes as larvae. Mahonias, of course, are evergreen plants. Solomon seal sawfly, the only sawfly you'll get on Solomon seal. The larvae, again, are distinctive. They're sort of greyish white in colour with black heads, and they often feed together in groups like this, starting at the tips of the leaves and working back to the stem. The adults are black with darkened wings, and they are out and about at the time when Solomon seal is in flower. Sometimes you'll see a Solomon seal which has been eaten and no larvae on it. They've been and gone. They've finished feeding and gone down into the soil to pupate. In that case, it's sometimes difficult to tell whether or not it was sawfly damage or whether it was slugs or snails, which will also feed on this plant. The way to make sure it is sawfly damage is to look at the stem of the Solomon seal, and there you'll see, if it is Solomon seal sawfly, a sort of linear scar about 25-30 millimeters in length, which is often sort of purplish brown in color, and which will have a vertical row of small holes. This is where the female has laid eggs, and those small holes that you see in the scar are where the young larvae have eaten their way out and emerged. Iris sawfly, again, the only sawfly which you'll find on iris. And this is very much associated with iris plants, which are growing in wet situations, like around ponds, lakes, canals, rivers, and so on. You get it on our native yellow flag iris, Iris pseudochorus. It also occurs on some other ornamental types of iris, which are grown in wet places. You won't find it on flag irises, which are growing in herbaceous borders. It doesn't seem to like that dry situation. It's got to be near water. The larvae are sort of olive green in color with lots of little white spots on them, often present in large numbers, and they sometimes make V-shaped notches in the leaf margin. It doesn't show too well in this photograph, but it is quite distinctive sometimes. You get quite sort of neat V-shaped notches where the larvae have been feeding. In heavy infestations, they will gradually reduce the height of the leaves. They start nibbling at the top and they reduce it down to stumps. The larvae, the adults, very similar to those of Solomon seals. They're black again with darkened wings, slightly shorter antennae though compared to Solomon seal sawfly. Some of the leaf mining sawflies are distinctive. Several species of Heterathrus. They're feeding inside the leaf. When they've completed their feeding, they will spin a circular cocoon in which they will eventually pupate. In the case of the Heterathrus species on sycamore and on field maple, when the larva has spun its cocoon, it cuts it out and it drops to the ground, but you're still left with this sort of distinctive pale circular patch, which is an indication that the mine was made by Heterathrus cereus. It was on sycamore. And there are other heteroarthra species which are more obliging because they actually remain inside the cocoon, inside the leaf. So this is Heteroarthris nemeratus on birch, Heteroarthris vagans on alder, and there are other species on aspen, on willows, and Wisneyi on field maple. There is another species of leaf mining sawfly on alder. Very obligingly, that one, when it's finished feeding, leaves the leaf, so there's no signs of any cocoon or pupating larva inside. So if you've got find some leaves in the field with leaf mining sawflies in them, take them home if they're reasonably well advanced, and within a few days, hopefully, you'll either see the circular cocoon appearing or the larvae will be crawling around outside the leaf, and that tells you you've got the other species, which is Phanusa dornii. Another leaf miner, which you get on geum species. This is again one which has several larvae in each mine, usually. So you get an irregular mine, which initially is pale in color, but will go brown in time. And this is something which has several generations. You get it on the native wild plants in the geums, and also some of the garden geums as well. Lysomachia, which is yellow loosestrife, has a distinctive larva, pale brown head, grey on top, pale underneath, and you'll find this on yellow loosestrife in wet places, and also on some of the garden Lysomachia species as well. Adult, not particularly distinctive, brown and black in colour. Geraniums, these are hardy geraniums, not the sort of geraniums with red flowers that are grown in flower pots, but the hardy ones are affected by geranium sawfly, and that creates a series of elongate, rounded holes in the foliage. The larvae, black head, black, sort of dark grey, black on top, pale underneath, easily dislodged from the leaves. If you turn a leaf over, they drop to the ground and you've lost them. So if you want to check whether or not the holes in your geraniums are caused by a sawfly, slide your hand underneath or sheet of newspaper underneath the plant before you tap the foliage, and with a bit of luck, some of these larvae will drop into your hand or onto the piece of paper. If your aquilegias are defoliated, the chances are you have Aquilegia sawfly, and they just chomp away at the foliage. It's one of those species which seems to come and go. You get bad years where there's a lot of defoliation, other years you don't see it at all. Palisade sawfly, this is one of the species which feeds as solitary individuals. So the amount of damage they do is not great, but when you find this species on either poplar or aspen, it's recognizable because the larva here produces a series of little sort of white secretions all around its feeding area, hence the name palisade or fence. And it's thought that these secretions have some sort of irritant properties, so that an ant or some other predator approaching will be driven away, allowing the larva to feed safely inside its little enclosure. Poplar, aspen, sawfly, Cladius grandis do feed like this. They're distinctive in appearance, pale in colour, yellow collar behind the head, which is black, and they just feed cheek by jowl like this on a leaf until it's eaten, and then they move on to the next one. Robinia sawfly, this is like the tree itself, a North American species, which is well established over here. Yellow and black as adults, pale green larvae. Way to find this is to stand underneath a Robinia tree, also known as a false acacia, and just look up. And what you're looking for is leaves which have small holes in them like this. And when you look at that leaf more closely, with a bit of luck, you'll find the caterpillar, the larva, feeding on the foliage. Or if it's been and gone or been eaten by something else, what you may find nearby the hole is this little sort of half moon silvery white structure here, which is where the epidermis of the leaf has been raised up when the egg was inserted. So if you find a Robinia leaf with a hole in it and this little semicircular silvery thing here, you know you've got Robinia sawfly, even if you haven't actually found it. You can see where it's been, because that's a telltale sign that an egg was laid there and the larva has then done the feeding damage. Aruncus sawfly, another non-native species on a non-native plant, but very widespread in this country, has larvae which chomp away at the foliage, and they can sometimes completely defoliate it. Several generations during the course of the summer. This is one of those species which is female only, so it's able to reproduce asexually. Zigzag sawfly, this is a relatively recent arrival in this country. It originates, I think, from Japan, got out into elsewhere in Europe and then spread over to here. Very easily recognized, it's on elm, because the young larvae, recently hatched larvae, make this very distinctive zigzag pattern. Why they do it, nobody knows, but that's what they do. Later on, the pattern becomes less obvious, but when you see it like that, it really can't be anything else. It's one of the Irish species, upright, Arshidae species, again, upright antennae there. And again, all female. Mountain ash goes on various sorbus species, but only those with pinnate leaves like this. It doesn't seem to like those with ovate leaves like white beam, which is also a sorbus. Pale yellow in colour, lots of black spots, feeding gregariously, only sawfly of this type which you're going to find on mountain ash. So again, if you've got the larvae and the 2 generations during the course of the summer, then you know what you've got. Figwort sawfly, this is one of the yellow and black banded Tenthredo species, and there are about 12 species in this country which have this sort of colour pattern on the abdomen, but only one has got all orange antennae, and that is the Figwort sawfly, Tenthredo scrophularii. The larvae are also quite distinctive, sort of greyish-white, lots of black spots. And you get this on Figworts of Verbascum nigrum, and on some garden plants, Phygelius and Buddleia sometimes. Privet sawfly, quite a pretty one. This one is a black and white markings, black and white partly on the legs, and dark red hind femora here. Larvae fairly indistinctive. This one is interesting though, because it's one of the few sawflies which as an adult feeds on foliage. This chewed up leaf here is where the adult has been macerating the tissues and presumably feeding on the juices which emerge. And you find this on privet, particularly wild privet, as opposed to the sort of garden hedge privet, and also sometimes on related plants like lilac and ash. Right, getting towards the end now. If you're interested in sawflies, and I hope you all are now, there is the inevitable website, British and Irish sawflies. Not as comprehensive perhaps as, say, the Bee Wars website, but it is something which is being built up and improved. On that website, you'll find useful information. There's a garden sawfly recording scheme, which concentrates on some of the easy to identify species, some of those which I've just been talking about. There's a checklist of British and Irish sawflies, a gallery of images of sawfly adults and larvae, something which is being built up all the time. And there's pages on resources for identification and study of sawflies. There isn't a formal recording scheme for sawflies, but people are encouraged to put any data they have on iRecord. Any records put on there, particularly if they're accompanied by a photograph, are being verified, and so the information will eventually find its way onto the National Biodiversity Network Atlas scheme. And so you're contributions will be appreciated. And of course, we do need lots of records of common species, not just the rare ones. Otherwise, that gives a sort of very unrealistic appearance of distribution maps. There is an active sawfly Facebook page where, if you're not wildly enthusiastic about sawflies, but you've got photographs of sawflies, you can put them on there, and hopefully that somebody will tell you what they are. You can't always identify sawflies from photographs, but quite often they can be assigned at least to a genus if you can't get any further. Right, so that's the end of the talk. I will stop sharing. I can.
Oh, thank you so much, Andrew. That's a fantastic presentation. Thank you. And yes, round of applause, please, virtually. And I was just, obviously, sawflies, the best group of insects, Hymenoptera, and thanks. I learned an awful lot about the diversity. So we've got a few questions coming in the chat, and should I start from the top and say, actually, one of the first questions to come in was from Jennifer Bunsey asking what the larvae look like, and you illustrated a wonderful variety of larvae. But are sawflies a sort of group where often the larvae are easier to identify than adults?
I'm just slightly down. I'm going into the chat so I can see.
Okay. Oh, I
What do
can
the
just
larvae
recap
look
them.
like? Well, they are caterpillar-like. And as I mentioned earlier, the way to distinguish them from those other types of caterpillars, Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies, is to count the number of clasping legs on the abdomen. Sawflies generally have 7, moths and butterflies, a maximum of 5.
So Sue Taylor asked about what you feel about AI offerings like OBS Identify. What are the sort of results like when people try and identify sawflies through OBS Identify, which is a very popular tool at the moment?
Yeah, I'm of an age which doesn't have a great deal of contact with AI, but yes, people are using things like Obsidian Identify, and it can help. But bear in mind, it is an educated guess on behalf of AI, and it won't always. You can't take it for gospel for what they're telling you. They will give you, I think, a percentage of confidence, which may vary from anything from 0 to 100%. Which gives you a guidance of may help in determining whether or not you think you've got the right answer. But realistically, unless it's something which is really distinctive, take it with a pinch of salt, I think.
Ray asked a question I wanted to ask as well. Basically, are they difficult to rear from larvae? And are there any tricks to rearing them through? And I know I've had a lot of experience in killing sawfly larvae instead of rearing them out.
Yeah. Are they difficult to rear from larvae? I think the answer to that, most people will say, is yes. And it may be something to do with the fact that they overwinter as pre-pupal larvae instead of going straight into a pupa, as a lot of Lepidoptera will do. And it's a question of trying to, I think, to mimic natural winter conditions. So if you keep them indoors over winter, they're not getting a period of cold and so on. It's better, I think, to put your breeding jars out of doors so they will get some cold weather during the winter. With the larvae, most of them will want to go into the soil to overwinter. So when you're trying to rear these things out, you need to have them in a container with some soil or peat or something of that nature that they can burrow into. The easiest ones to breed through are probably those which have more than one generation a year, in which case, if you catch an early generation, you can usually have done a better chance of getting out some adults compared to those where you've got to keep them over winter.
Brilliant. Thank you. Zoe had a couple of questions. One about basically how do we go about, what's the best way to go about collecting sawflies? And then sounds like we're due for an update on the British keys for sawflies, and is anyone working on this? And I'm sure many people would love to see updated keys to British sawflies.
Best way of collecting? Well, there are various ways. I mean, you can go around using your eyes, looking for sawflies on foliage, looking for sawflies on flowers, which you'll certainly find some on. And you won't get so many sawflies that way, but you do sometimes get the opportunity to observe behavior and sometimes get a host plant association. But the main way in which I go about collecting sawflies is I just go sweep through the vegetation, aiming particularly for plants which I know are likely to be sawfly host plants. And then from time to time, I look in my net and shove in the pooter and pick out the specimens that are of interest. So in that way, you get a greater quantity and variety of sawflies. But of course, you don't get any sort of actual information about what they were doing or what they were on at the time when you collected them. Yep, there is a need, I think, for an updated, certainly key. There are people who have been working on it. David Shepherd has been working on it for many years. Whether it'll actually get to an endpoint, I don't know. But there are other people who are sort of mulling over the problem. One of the difficult, I think, in producing a new taxonomic key is that there are some difficult areas of taxonomy. And that's what people sort of run up against a hard rock, I think. They can start off doing a revised taxonomic key with the sort of relatively easy ones, and that's great. But it is the more difficult nematine ones which are harder to crack.
Great. Yulima asked, any tips for preventing gooseberry sawfly?
Any tips to prevent gooseberry sawfly? That's my phone. Hang on.
Is that somebody phoning up with the same question?
Hello. No, I'm in a Zoom meeting. Can't talk now. Sorry about that. How can you do with sort of, well, keep your eyes open, I think is the answer. The females tend to lay their eggs sort of in the middle of the bush. And what happens is that you, unless you're looking carefully, you miss the young larvae. They gradually eat their way upwards and outwards, and then you're left with a defoliated bush. So from about sort of mid-April onwards, you want to be looking for larvae eating their way on the foliage inside the bush rather than on the outside. And at that stage, you can either, if you're lucky, rub them out with your fingers, or you might have to resort to an insecticide if there's a lot of larvae there. It is one of those there's very little damage because there aren't so many adults around.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, advantages to having the gooseberry larvae, sawfly larvae as well. I mean, Mark Shaw, I think, studied them in his garden in Edinburgh and found a new species of ichneumoniid wasp parasitizing them. Always. Although sawflies are not interesting just as hosts for ichneumoniid wasps, of course. There was a question from Jennifer about on lime trees. Does anything else make little red bean galls?
Well, the bean galls are on willows, sallows, rather than lime trees. No, I think it's all sort of like if you're getting galls like that on willows, it is all due to sawflies. The color of those galls can vary. Sometimes they're bright red, sometimes they're sort of yellowish green, and I think that's partly due to exposure to sunlight. They tend to get redder if they're fully exposed to sunlight.
Can I just ask a question? Because I've always thought, sawflies and aculeates are roughly the sort of same number of species in Britain, but historically, many more people have been interested in aculeates. But do you know why there's been a sort of recent upsurge of interest in sawflies? Because there has been a lot more interest in recent years, and as you pointed out, that amazing website and lots of more initiatives. Do you think there's been something that's kick-started this interest?
Yeah, I mean certainly ant species and wasps have had a head start on sawflies. So probably sexier insects in this case. They are, useful things as pollinators, parasites, and that sort of thing. And sawflies have lagged behind. I don't know why, because Benson's key has been around since the 1950s and is not as difficult to use as some of the other RES keys. Why is it becoming more popular now? I don't know what has influenced that. Certainly, I think recording has changed a lot. There are a lot more people going out now simply with a camera taking pictures, and they want their photographs identified. And so that's bringing some people into the sawfly area.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's all the questions answered. Thank you so much, Andrew.
It falls to me, Andrew, on everybody's behalf to thank you for a terrific overview of a fascinating group. I have to admit that as a lepidopterist, I mean, I've been doing butterflies and moths for well over 60 years. In those early days, looking at caterpillars, thinking I'd found something truly exotic on the Lepidoptera front. And to my dismay at that point, it turned out to be a sawfly. The more we know, of course, about these things as we grow older and our scope of interest broadens, then the more we become fascinated in all these other groups. Thank you so much for entertaining us all and for opening our eyes to something which we should take more notice of, a group that looks fascinating, plenty of species there, plenty of interesting information that still needs to be gathered and can be shared and people can learn from. So thanks for a splendid afternoon's presentation. We're all very, very grateful. I think an applause from everybody by hand, whatever we could do. So thank you, Andrew.